The hammer fell like a verdict. For a beat, the room swallowed its breath, and the sun sliding through high windows cut the dust in half, bright above the audience, dim over the woman on the platform. Sarah Adams stood as if planted there by force, her hair braided into a single tight rope down her back, her hands stained faintly at the fingertips from hours at the needle, her face a calm that was not peace but the hard shell of someone who had learned to keep her grief inside. Her father's voice filled the space between the creak of the benches and the coughs and whispers. Zakaria Adams had always spoken as though his words were ledgers and his children were entries. He stepped forward with his chest puffed, with a glint in his eye that had once been mistaken for pride and now looked very like calculation. He called it discipline, he called it necessity. To the men leaning forward in the auction hall he called obedience. To Sarah it sounded like betrayal. Bids rose like a tide, forms of money, gestures of a community more comfortable with currency than with kin. People laughed in the low way of those who believed themselves safe on the bleachers of other people's shame. A butcher, a small-time rancher, a man with a broad hat and rough hands offered sums that would buy winter oats and a new plow. A sheriff shifted uneasily at the edge of the platform, aware of the law, and yet aware too of the town's appetite for spectacle. No one shouted stop. Then Wade Lawrence entered like a wind. He did not come in with the swagger of a man wanting applause. He rode through the door as if he had been part of the dust outside, saddle creak and the smell of dry horsehair following him. His coat was practical, his jaw set with a kindness that did not seek the crowd's notice. He set a leather pouch on the auction table with no flourish, and the coins inside made a thorough, serious sound when he let them settle. "I'll put up 500, he said, and his voice was level, not triumphal. The currency was large enough that the murmurs softened. Zakaria's smile faltered. He had assumed the best bidders would be small men with small ambitions. A man with a marshal's steadiness and a pile of gold was not in his calculations. Wade leaned forward, hands on the edge of the table, and looked at Sarah as if she were more than the room's curiosity. "I'm buying his claim," he told the hall, words he made plain and deliberate. "Not the woman. The legal right he thinks he holds over her." There was a flinch in the crowd. The distinction hung in the air, and for the first time anyone had spoken for what ought to be obvious. One's self is not the same as someone else's claim. Zakaria, reddening, tried to recover his tone. "You," he began, but the leather of his voice was thin. Money changed hands. The sheriff counted it but said nothing. Sale recorded, claim transferred, the ledger would have an entry, the rumor mill would have a new turn. Sarah stared at the pouch. Her body was a map of tensions, anger traced along the spine in ridges, humiliation heated her ears. To be brought forward in public and treated like a commodity was a kind of violence that did not bruise in the way blows did, but it hollowed. She had known poverty, the slow wearing away of a childhood to bills and hard words from a father who called himself provider, but felt to her like a man who sold pieces of himself to retell his worth. Wade met her gaze and, before the room could decide whether to cheer or to sneer, he spoke as if he were asking for permission rather than giving a rule. "Where do you want to go?" The question landed differently than any formula of command. It was not a question of escaping him, it was a question of choosing. For the first time that day, the crowd stopped filling the silence. They leaned toward it, wanting the answer as if it were the last scene of a play. Sarah's answer was not immediate. She had been schooled in the economy of small replies, in the way a single word could make a man certain of his control. But this man did not ask for obedience, he asked for direction. She had thought her voice forfeit, until now. "To San Francisco," she said at last, voice low but steady. "To Aunt Cordelia." Wade inclined his head. He did not smile. That would have been presumptuous. He extended his hand instead, as a sailor might, an offer across uncertain water. "Then that's where you'll go, if you'll have me as your company." She studied his hand and the smallness of its offering. Her father had sold the idea of her usefulness for a larger home and finer clothes. This man bought a claim and laid a potential escape on the table. For a shuttered heartbeat she thought of refusing, of standing on the platform and letting the shame burn hot enough to turn into coal inside her chest. Then she imagined Cordelia's tidy shop, a place where fabric smelled of lavender and starch rather than of men's coarse exhalations. Her fingers curled around the memory of a needle slipping through cloth, a motion that steadied her. She took Wade's hand. If this hook pulled you in, hit subscribe to follow Sarah's journey. They left with little pomp. Wade's horse stepped slow at first, and then into a gait that covered ground without showing off speed. Sarah sat pillowed by travel bundles, her spine a worn line against the saddle. The town shrank behind them, dust rising like a soft curtain. Zakaria followed for a short distance, blustering with words that were meant to sting, but only revealed the way a shell of a man tried to build his dignity with sound. For a moment, Sarah thought of hurling a cutting remark at him, something that would shatter the brittle armor of his reputation. Instead, she chose silence, the kind of silence that is not surrender, but a collecting of power. They passed the scrub and seeps of the hinterland. The sky opened wide, an enormous honest blue. The land outside town had the way of things that needed no permission: cactus, tamarisk, the tracks of coyotes that cut nervous lines by night. Wade kept to a pace that let the land have its measured breathing. He was not talkative. When he spoke, his sentences were like planks across a river, steady enough to cross on, not ornamental. At the inn in Elkwood, Wade secured a room for them both. Though he took care to make clear the arrangement was practical, he would sleep near the horses. He chose this out of habit and from a respect. He understood the marrow of a woman's fear when far from her kin. The stable smelled warm and quiet in a way the inn could not match. In the dim light, Sarah mended a hem on her skirt, the needle finding and fitting the fabric back to itself with a small, intimate authority. Wade watched, not as a man who claimed ownership of the work, but as one who recognized craft. "You sew," he said at last. "I learned from Cordelia," she replied. "She keeps me away from my father when she can." Her fingers kept moving. The motion was a kind of prayer. Wade nodded as if he understood, though he did not press her for details. The conversation that followed was stitched of small revelations. Wade spoke of his past in measured strokes. Once a deputy's hand, later a man who refused to be pinned to a badge when it conflicted with his conscience. He told, with an economy of words, about a sister who had been traded into an arrangement that killed her light before her years did, an event that had carved his sense of justice into a living thing. There was no flourish, only a steady, bitterness-tinged truth. It explained his action without demanding gratitude. Sarah, in her turn, let slip pieces of who she had been. The woman who learned late that the kitchen could be an arena of cold words, who had buried a mother with hands that still smelled of starch and rosewater. She did not say all the details. Trauma has rooms with locked doors. But she allowed enough light in to show where the darkness stood. It was trust by inches, not by leaps. They rode through towns where the stationers had glass counters and boys sold penny papers. They took a diligence for miles, the rattling box on wheels that felt like a womb against the harsh outside. On the coach, other travelers filled the hours with talk. A reverend with a tie that tried too hard to look proper, a pair of Hendersons who complained about the quality of hotel food. Sarah noticed how the reverend's eyes lingered on her once, curiosity mixed with a patronizing compassion. Wade sat between her and the aisle, a human hinge. When the reverend's remarks made it into the air as moralizing platitudes, Wade's jaw tightened, not in showdown, but in an expression that said, "Not here." He had no taste for public righteousness applied to private wounds. The train to Sacramento steamed like a beast that had swallowed a storm. The landscape flickered. Fence posts, occasional stands of cottonwood, a wharfed smear of factories as they approached the city. Wade's reasons for going to Sacramento were practical. The man had business to tend. In the years since his deputy days, he had kept one eye toward the law, not as a suit of armor, but as a toolbox. He had a ledger of debts old as a bruise, men who owed justice more than they owed coin. Zakaria Adams was one such item, but the law could only do so much. The law required witnesses, procedure, time, and time was a thing Sarah could ill afford. The world had already revised her sense of future back toward smallness. Wade understood this and matched his pace to hers in the small mercies. He bought her new boots in Sacramento without making a show of them, purchased plain but solid thread and needles for her kit, and took pains, ridiculous in their simplicity, to ensure her plate had stew and not scraps of gravy. These were not gestures of patronage, but of respect. A man who buys you provisions is not the same as a man who buys a claim. Wade knew the line and honored it. When they arrived in San Francisco, the air tasted different. Salt and coal smoke, a city that did not pretend to be country kind. It was crowded, loud, full of streets that smelled of fish and tar and horses, and lined with stores that displayed bolts of cloth like flags. Cordelia's shop sat tucked away from the roar, a neat rectangle of glass and wood with the scent of lavender and starch, and, beneath it all, honest bustle. Inside, the women who worked there moved with assured hands, scissoring patterns, pinning hems, with an air of practical joy. Cordelia herself was not a looming aunt, but a woman who commanded her space with a slim, bright authority. She had an eye for fabric and an eye for people. "Child," she said when she saw Sarah, "look at you." Cordelia's hands were quick to examine, to smooth a shoulder, to drop a sensible word in a place that needed it. She hugged Sarah with a familiarity that felt like reclamation. "You always had good hands. We'll have you turning out frocks in no time." Cordelia's shop was more than a place to learn stitches. It was a school for independence. Women came for mending, for new frocks, for corset alterations, and left with pay, and sometimes with the beginning of an account to their name. Cordelia taught Sarah about ledgers, about pricing, about barter, and the small math of running a room where beauty and necessity met. Sarah sewed and listened, and began to dream in a different key, one that put her work at the center rather than at the margins. Wade visited when he could. He arrived like a man who had crossed battlefields and kept a map home. Visits were infrequent because the law did not sleep. There were hearings, papers to file, a judge in a town away who granted the kind of earmen like Wade had to court. But when he came, he carried small things that mattered. A letter wrapped in oilcloth with the steadiness of a hand that knew how to protect what it held. A photograph slotted into a pocket watch frame of a small ranch house he'd looked over and liked. The photograph was modest. One room, a porch, a tree. But to Wade, it was a place he could make steady. He left it on Cordelia's counter, not as a claim on Sarah, but as an invitation to consider a different kind of life. They began to write when the city's bustle made meetings difficult. Letters arrived on parchment, ink varying with weather and mood. Wade's handwriting was spare and tidy. His words were not the florid sorts found in novels, but sentences that made safety visible. "I found a place with ground enough for 2 gardens," he wrote in a letter sealed with a sober wax. "A small house that needs paint. There's room for a shop for hands. Tell me what you want of it." Sarah's replies were careful at first. She told him of a woman who had come in one afternoon asking for a funeral dress at a price she could not meet. She described the way a machine in Cordelia's back room whirred, and how a spool of thread could ransom a week's rent. In writing, she practiced being seen on her own terms. She asked about the ranch, about the soil, about the risk of coyotes, that measured his dream into workable facts. Each letter was a stitch across distance. There was a patient craft to the intimacy they were building, no sudden storms of passion, no declarations that demanded an answer. Instead, there was an exchange of tools and a sharing of small domestic plans. Even then, Sarah never forgot the way the auction had felt. She understood the danger of exchanging dependence for another sort of dependence. There was a caution ingrained in her that made her ask for assurances in many forms. She insisted Wade make clear what his purchase had been. He obliged. "You did not buy me," she wrote once, her ink a dark line on the page. "You bought my father's claim. I do not forget that." The caution was not accusation, but a boundary. Wade replied with a sentence that might as well have been a vow. "I bought only his claim. I will not, cannot, treat you as his property. You will tell me what place you choose in this world, and I will stand beside you in the work to make it happen." His words were a rope thrown across a swift current. Sarah took hold of it slowly, testing its firmness with the heels of her fingers. Outside the small intimacies of correspondence and work, there was the other world, the one where men measured their honor by how many coins they could throw into a pile and called it justice. Wade moved within it with caution and grit. He met with Judge Thomas Harmon, a territorial man with a face that read like a ledger and a habit of listening twice before he decided. The judge had seen his share of men trying to civilize their consciences with paper binding. He saw in Wade not a crusader, but a man who kept a scale that did not tip lightly. Harmon advised, slowly, methodically, what steps could be taken within the law. The law required evidence and witness testimony that would stand up in court without becoming a spectacle. It required time, and time was a pleasure and a peril. Wade set about the task with the same steadiness he used to mount a horse in a rainstorm. He gathered witnesses. The butcher who had bid at the auction, and who now in private admitted he had thought the sale unseemly. The sheriff who, though uncomfortable, could attest to the money exchanged and the context. There were men who would step forward if they could stand the town's shiftless glare. The work was legal and humiliating by turns. It required both the indignation that moves a courtroom and the patience that keeps a grave. Sarah watched these efforts with an impatience tempered by prudence. She wanted justice, yes, but not justice fed by spectacle. There was a time in which a public flogging, or worse, would have been applauded by the town's crowd, but she wanted her father judged as he had acted, by laws, by truth, not by the fevered frenzy of a mob. And yet there were nights when old feelings returned as if summoned by some unkind wind, the memory of her father's hand, rough and demanding, the taste of words meant to belittle. She would sit by Cordelia's sewing bench and let the needle move through cloth, the motion steadying her spirit. The needle was more than a tool. It was a compass that always pointed toward work, toward usefulness, toward the slow rebuilding of a life by right angles and gentle curves. Sewing taught her that something could be unraveled and restitched into better form. Wade's visits became steadier. He would come bearing the quiet competence of a man who had chosen a path that mixed duty and tenderness. On one of those visits, he brought the deed to a small parcel of land, a plain sheet of paper that smelled faintly of dust and horsehair. He placed it before her on the counter of Cordelia's shop and let his gaze rest on her face. Cordelia bustled, more helpful than intrusive, knowing better than to let a man's gesture go unexamined. "There's no hurry to answer now," Wade said. He was careful, as if words might break a fragile thing. "I want you to know it's there." Sarah touched the paper. It was not a promise of paradise, only the outline of a place where choices could be made. She thought of a life not given but chosen, a shop of her own, a room where children might learn to sew as she had, a porch with a low fence where she could sit and mend and see the sun move across the day. The thought made something like a laugh rise in her chest, soft, incredulous. She had not believed such an image could exist for her. But even as plans settled, there remained a cloud. Zakaria did not vanish into the past. Men as stubborn as roots will not be pulled without leaving soil exposed. Rumors rode the wind into Cordelia's neighborhood. Talk that Zakaria had neighbors ready to swear he'd been a hard man pushed beyond his means. Talk that family obligations sometimes ruin men who have no better sense than to blame those closest to them. The law was slow. The town was quicker to speculation. Sarah had to choose where to place her trust, into the hands of the court, into Wade's steadiness, or into her own small, newly found agency. One afternoon a letter came that turned the household quiet into a small wave. It was from Wade, brought by a courier with a well-traveled look. The courier handed it into Cordelia's shop as if he knew he was delivering something larger than paper. Sarah unfolded the page with fingers that trembled only just. Wade had written of a plan, of formal charges to be brought, of a judge who would hear the case, of a security that would be sought to make certain Zakaria could not decamp with goods or money. It was legal language, but beneath it lived the moral intention, to hold a man accountable not by revenge, but by the law he had wound himself into breaking. Sarah read the lines twice and then 3 times. Each sentence rearranged the interior furniture of her fear. She felt as if the room had tilted and settled. The fight would be public. The examination of her father would reopen old wounds. The law could bring vindication, but vindication would require telling her truth again and again in a courtroom where men's faces would be plain and unblinking. She met Wade at the edge of the city that evening, where the day fell into a color like ironing on a shirt. "I don't want to be the engine of his ruin," she said, voice even. She hated that she had to explain her motives to someone who had already risked his peace for her. "I will not have my life built on destroying his." Wade's answer was a look that held dozens of small, careful affections. "I don't want ruin," he said. "I want to make sure the law recognizes you as the person you choose to be, not a line on your father's ledger. That requires speaking plainly. It requires the court." She considered the word court like a rough stone in her mouth. But she also considered Cordelia's steady hands, the small profit that came from a day's mending, the way her own fingers had learned a new kind of counting. The law, for all its slowness, could give her a sort of shore to step onto, something that would hold its ground even when men in the town found new ways to be cruel. "Then we do it," she said. He took her hand, not in the old public gesture of possession, but as a clasp of partnership. "We do it together," Wade said. "And whatever else happens, I will not take your choice away." They had little more than that as an agreement, but it was enough for the moment. The court would move when it moved. The path would wind. For Sarah, this was merely the beginning of a process, one that would test the endurance of law and the sturdiness of a man's promise. Days in Cordelia's shop stretched into a measured rhythm. Sarah learned to cut patterns with an economy of movement that saved cloth and time. She counted stitches and money and measured the small satisfactions of independence. Cordelia taught her to lay accounts so that patrons left owing not only with dresses but with dignity. The women who worked there became a kind of family. Frances, whose laugh was a short bell, May, who could fit a bodice with a glance, and Rose, who always carried peppermint candy in a little tin. They traded stories and gossip and food, and sometimes the weight of listening. In the evenings, Sarah would sit with an oil lamp and a spool, tracing the letters of Wade's name on the inside of envelopes until the ink blurred and became a watermark in her mind. Wade returned less and less like a distant rider, and more like a presence with reasons. Papers to be filed in Sacramento, a judge to see in a courthouse where the benches smelled of dust, witnesses to be found. His visits were still infrequent but steady. Each time he arrived, he brought news of small triumphs. A man who agreed to testify, a document filed properly in a drawer where it would be seen by the right eyes. He moved in the legal world the way a good craftsman moves in his shop, attentive to detail, unwilling to let a loose thread go unknotted. Outside of legal and practical concerns, there was another current moving quietly between them. It was not dramatic. It had nothing to do with stolen kisses or swift declarations. It was found in the way Wade brought an extra parcel of fabric because it reminded him of a gown she had once made. In the way he would stand outside the shop and buy the first plate of anything for the street urchins who peered in the window. Sarah noticed that Wade's humor, when it came, was gentle, and that his hands, large and steady, had a surprising care for small things. He could mend a broken bridle as easily as he could coax a frightened horse. To Sarah, it looked like constancy more than romance, an assortment of good habits that one day might look like love. And yet, there was always the memory of the platform, of the way faces in the crowd had treated her as a novelty. Even in the private confines of a shop, the world had ways of reminding her of the danger of being reduced to spectacle. Once, a man from back in Paradise walked into Cordelia's shop with the swagger of one who thought the past was either a joke or a debt. He commented loudly about the auction, as if the day had been a public show rather than a wound. His words were meant to provoke. Sarah met him with the cold, unyielding gaze of someone who had stood through humiliation and found a different center of gravity. She did not strike him down in speech. She simply asked, in a voice that made the interesting men in the room fall silent, whether he had anything to buy. He had not. He left without the theater he sought. The law, the shop, the letters, these things assembled like beams. Each one by itself was a slow, steady measure. Together they made a frame. Sarah felt the house of her life beginning to stand. She did not yet know the color of the wallpaper, or whether the porch would face east or west, but she knew the beams were placed with care. One evening, as twilight pulled the city into a soft blue, Wade arrived with a man from Sacramento who carried himself like a man who had not come just to talk business. Judge Harmon sat with them at Cordelia's back table, his expression a map of careful calculation. He had come, he said, because the law required a voice who would not be swayed by the town's appetite. He had heard the facts and was inclined to listen. But he pressed for caution. Rashness could turn a worthy case into spectacle. Justice is proof, the judge said plainly, and proof is a slow thing. It's a thing that requires patience. It's also a thing that needs to be done without making the person who seeks it smaller than the wrong done to them. Sarah felt the weight of the judge's words land like a grain of sand, small but enough to mark a place in the hourglass. She was not the woman who had walked onto the platform empty-handed. She had hands that made things. She had a mind that could plan. She had friends who could vouch for her, and a man who would hold the course of law steady. That, she decided, would have to suffice for now. When the men left and the lamp burned low, Wade stood with his hand on the back of a chair. He looked at Sarah, not as one who claimed, but as one who proposed labor by side. "If the court goes against your father," he said, "there will be consequences. I want you to know that I'm prepared to stand with you through them." She measured the sound of his words, tested their weight as if they were coins. "And if it does not?" she asked. Wade's face softened. "Then we start again," he said. "Like any other good work, we start again." She smiled then, a small, true thing, and for a moment the year that had begun with the hammer's fall seemed to smooth like a seam that had been pressed flat. The future remained uncertain. The trial would come, with witnesses and testimonies and the public eyes that watch and judge. But there was a thread now running through the days, a question repeated in softer forms. "Where do you want to go?" And answers stitched in ink and needle, and sometimes in the simple gift of another person's steady presence. They could not know then how wide the turning of events would be, nor how the small decisions of afternoons and letters and legal filings would gather into something that would surprise the town. For the moment, the city exhaled into evening, the clack of hoofbeats in the street, a woman humming as she counted out change, the distant iron of a ship's horn. Sarah folded a scrap of fabric, feeling the weight of it in her palms, and placed it on the counter as if it were a map. She had a plan to learn the trade, to keep accounts, to make a small, honest living. She had a man at her side who could navigate the law, and she had, cradled in the in-between, a choice. Night closed on the shop, and Cordelia locked the door with the ease of long habit. There were letters to seal and pins to count. Wade walked Sarah to the edge of the block where the street lamps cast pools of amber. He did not kiss her, not because he feared the moment, but because he would not make a private thing public out of habit. Their goodbye was the careful kind, hands given, a promise kept in a look. He took his saddlebag and the photograph of the small ranch he had shown her. She walked back under the lamps to the shop, her small kingdom of cloth and stitch and quiet authority, and thought of a question that had begun it all. "Where do you want to go?" It was still a question she had to answer every morning in small ways. In the number of stitches she made, in the way she priced a hem, in the letters she penned. The question pulsed between the beams of law and love and work. It would not be answered once and for all. Rather, it would be answered in choices, stitched one after another, until something resembling a life took shape. Outside, the night wind carried the sound of a distant carriage. Inside, Cordelia lit the lamp again and began to mend a collar. Sarah sat by the window and wrote a letter to Wade. Not long, not sweeping. Only the facts of the day, the measure of a hem, the name of a woman who had come in and needed a dress for a funeral she could not afford. She told him she had given the woman a discount. She told him she had counted the pins and the salts of the day. She signed her name like a promise and sealed the envelope. When the courier came the next morning, he brought with him more than paper. He carried a rumor from paradise and the hint of a storm that would not be weathered merely by good sewing and patient law. Zakaria had been seen speaking in low tones with men who held grudges, and with a neighbor who said he had a mind to flee. Court filings would need to be expedited if the law was to do its work. Sarah folded the correspondence letter with hands that did not shake. She had reason to fear. She also had reason to trust a network of alliances that had begun in the shop and been tested on the road. She kept her hand on the envelope for a moment longer, feeling the oil of the paper and the press of the seal, and then she rose. There was work to be done, appointments to be kept, witnesses to prepare, a courtroom bench to face. As she stepped out into the morning, the city opened before her. Goods to be measured, people to be met, a legal process to be navigated. The path was not a straight one. It wound through law, and through the private rooms of promises. It would, in time, reveal consequences none of them yet imagined. For now, Sarah put one foot before the other, needle in hand, a woman choosing her way by small, deliberate acts. The question lingered in the air like a chord that demanded resolution. Where do you want to go? The morning the court convened, San Francisco held its breath in a thin gray hush. Winter leaned against the windows like a hand upon the glass, and the city's usual bustle seemed to defer to the business of law. Cordelia's shop was bright with activity before sunrise. Steam from a kettle, the sound of scissors, and the quiet economy of women dressing the day into order. Sarah moved through the work as she always did, measuring, counting, folding, and beneath the steady motions there ran a coiled attention, the part of her that kept watch. Cordelia had been practical in the way that keeps a household from chaos. She'd chosen a dress for Sarah that spoke of dignity rather than display, sober wool, stitched with meticulous care, pockets deep enough to hold a handkerchief and a small sewing kit. Frances pinned a fold with an efficiency that suggested ceremony was only another sort of work. May ironed the lapels until they held a disciplined matte shine. "You'll stand like the woman you are," Cordelia said, and her voice had neither pity nor pretense, only assurance. Outside, people were gathering. A handful of those who had not been present at the auction came from the town proper with curiosity. Others came because they believed in the sanctity of order or because they wanted to witness the fall or the saving. The sheriff kept to the edges, his uniform not as authoritative as the law required, but sufficient. Men and women took positions on benches that smelled of old varnish and wood smoke. Someone had opened a window to let in the thin, clean air. Judge Thomas Harmon presided as if he were a man who had learned the gravity of words. His robes were soberly cut. His countenance carried the steady patience of someone who had sat through more than one dispute that read as small in public and deep in private. He listened to the opening statements with an eye that asked questions with the tilt of his head rather than the sound of his voice. The indictment laid out the practical wrongs. Zakaria Adams had represented to the town and to public authorities that he possessed a legal right to sell his daughter's service or control, that he had the guardianship authority to pledge her labor and obedience as a commodity. The charge named it for what it was, the fraudulent assertion of authority and the unlawful restraint and contraction that sought to treat a person as a bargaining piece. The law in the territory was not ignorant of the mess of human family and poverty. It recognized that men could and did bend children into debts. That was what this case claimed Zakaria had done. Zakaria sat in the dock with the same stubborn angle to his jaw he had shown on the platform, but there was less color in his face. His defense was the thing desperate men say when they must make a poor choice sound like necessity. He had acted for the family, for their survival, for the order of things that had always been known to him. He spoke of debts, of lost work, of a life that could have been eased had there been funds. He tried to wrap his cruelty in the shawl of duty. Some in the courtroom looked at him with a rough sympathy. Others watched his mouth as if waiting for sharpness to show. Witnesses came forward. Cordelia's testimony was straightforward and practical. She spoke of Sarah's work, of the way the shop provided wages and small accounts, of the manner in which women came in and went out without becoming objects of public exchange. Her words described a life. The butcher, who'd bid at the auction in part out of habit, a public man used to showing his coin, testified that he'd considered the spectacle improper upon sober reflection, and that his bid had been meant for the supposed payment of debt and not to claim private possession. The sheriff admitted that money had changed hands, but that the legal basis for what Zakaria had claimed was thin, and that the town's appetite had outpaced law. Sarah's testimony was the turn many had come to hear. She did not rise to mount a drama. She rose to name facts, the nature of her father's statements, the context in which she had been forced forward, the emptiness of the claim against her. Her voice did not tremble much, though once, when she spoke of the long nights after her mother's death, she felt the ground shift in her chest and had to count a row of stitches in her head to keep steady. Cordelia's workshop had taught her an economy of speech that was practical rather than sentimental. She described what had been taken from her, the chance to choose her own labor, and her right to refuse, and the way that right mattered. "You said to me, 'You will obey,'" she told the court, and the words were simple. "My father said it like a ledger entry. I am not an entry." The courtroom took in the sentence in silence. Even those who had come only for spectacle felt the shift. It was not theatrical. It was a naming. Wade did not take the stand in a grand show. He offered the facts as a man accustomed to measurement and to the slow work of proof. He explained how he had purchased Zakaria's claim, the claim being a set of assertions and debts Zakaria defined, and had done so precisely to remove the immediate lever of coercion. He made plain, in measured words, that money had been exchanged to extinguish a legal assertion, and that the legal record showed the transfer of that claim. He laid out, for the court's benefit, the steps he had taken with Judge Harmon to secure witnesses and to gather testimony that would hold weight. The defense counsel tried to make the case a familial tragedy, not a legal violation, and argued that Zakaria had been entitled to family authority. But the law, under the judge's direction, required evidence of unlawful restraint and the making of monetary promises that sought to commodify a person's liberty. Tradition, the judge said, did not excuse the infringement of a person's right to choose. The courtroom hearings ran the length of a day into evening. Witnesses were careful to avoid spectacle. The prosecutor, with a voice that favored facts over flourish, showed the ledger, copies of the transaction, notes on receipts, parish records, and tied the money to an attempt to treat Sarah's obedience as an item of trade. It was a tedious thing, the slow tying of words to law, but it was precisely what the judge had cautioned. Proof required patience. At the end of the day, Judge Harmon's summation was steady. He spoke about community and the lines a law must draw to protect the vulnerable. He reminded the court that the law did not exist to punish desperation, but to preserve the dignity of persons when desperation tempted men to call moral wrongs by other names. The verdict, when it came, guilty on counts of unlawful assertion and fraudulent restraint, was not a triumph so much as a correction. The judge pronounced a sentence that balanced reparation and confinement. Zakaria would be imprisoned for a term appropriate to the offense and pay a fine modest by some measures but significant enough to dampen any quick return to the marketplace of claims. The judge ordered the sale of his recoverable property to be stayed and placed assets into a trust to be administered for Sarah's benefit, with Cordelia named as a co-trustee until further instructions could be arranged. The moment the judge's gavel landed on the bench, the air shifted. There was no raucous cheering. Victory in a court is rarely the explosive thing that plays in the mind. It is a quiet closing of a door on an immediate danger. Sarah felt the release as a thing that went outward from her chest, like a breath she had forgotten she had been holding. There was relief, yes, and an undercurrent of grief for the man who had been her father and who had put bread above tenderness. Zakaria's face had grown small in the public room. He left under the sheriff's custody, not as a tragic figure, but as a man whose choice had consequences. He would serve his sentence, and while the law permitted later appeals and petitions, the structural protection for Sarah was in place. The trust ensured that Zakaria could not turn to quick fleeces and run with goods that might satisfy his pride and leave her destitute again. The judge's decision threaded protection through the legal fabric she would need. Afterward, in the quiet of Cordelia's back room, Sarah allowed herself to feel the complexity all at once. Relief was braided with sorrow. A man who had once been a provider and a tyrant in turns was now a prisoner. That outcome did not fill the hole left by a mother's absence and a father's betrayal. It only protected the life she was determined to build. Wade stood at some distance, not as a sentinel, but as a companion who understood that law had its own pace. "It's done," he said when they had a moment alone. His voice carried both tiredness and a kind of steady ease, as though he had put down a heavy pack and found his shoulders lighter for it. Sarah looked at him. The court had taken public testimony and delivered correction. What the two of them had been mending privately, trust, future plans, a cautious intimacy, had also been tested. She thought of the ledger and the needle. Both were tools that could build or undo, depending on use. "That's one kind of ending," she said, "but the life I want will take work." Wade inclined his head. "Then we'll work it," he said. Together. The months that followed passed in a rhythm that was neither sudden nor slothful, but like sewing where each stitch counts. Winter gave way to a first sharp promise of spring. Sarah continued in Cordelia's shop, and word of the case traveled in measured ways across the county. Some townsfolk still whispered, some apologized in the way of men who had watched and hoped for easy answers. Business at the shop grew in a modest, respectable way. Women who had not dared to ask for better pay found new courage to commission and purchase. Cordelia used some of the trust's funds to secure supplies and to seed the idea of a little wing of the shop where apprentices might learn a trade for wages that counted toward their independence. Wade, meanwhile, worked in the stead that belonged to him, not as a master, but as a man who had learned to use muscle and law to protect others. He spent time in Sacramento, filing papers and then returning to the small ranch he had begun to tend. He wrote with the same even hand in which he had penned letters, not extravagant, but forthcoming with detail. "There's a hollow in the eastern field where the sun sets slow," one letter read. "It will grow peas and a fig if we set it right. There's room on the porch for your chair and for a sewing bench." Sarah considered it as a plan rather than a decree. The trust established by the judge had been designed to protect her against renewed attempts at control. Cordelia had been named co-trustee, and the judge had placed a provision that any transfer of property or new arrangements would require Sarah's express consent. It was small legal armor against the past. Sarah insisted on reading each document herself, and Judge Harmon sent copies and explanations. She asked questions about the language, about how long the trust might last, about her rights should she choose to marry. The law, at its best in those days, could be arranged to preserve choice. She wanted that in black ink and signed paper. The question that had started everything, "Where do you want to go?" had grown in shape. Now it was not just about geography, but about who she would be in the place she chose. The letters between her and Wade continued to build that map. They spoke of practicalities and small domestic dreams. A window that let in the morning light, a rack for drying shirts, a place where Cordelia could teach a group of apprentices when she visited. They spoke of children perhaps, never in having terms, but in possibilities that might be chosen. Each line was an agreement not to possess but to propose. Spring turned the ranch from a photograph into a place with its own seasons. Wade wrote of the house with paint peeling at one corner and a porch slanted toward late afternoons. "It needs work to be ours," he wrote. "A woman with a needle could make a house hold a story." He left it with that, an honest, modest invitation, and let Sarah decide if and when she would join him. When Wade returned from Sacramento that spring, he did not bring the deed as a surprise so much as a continuing conversation. He placed the paper on Cordelia's counter again, and this time watched Sarah as she traced the pencil lines and read the legal language. The paper named a parcel and described a small dwelling and a field. It did not promise a castle, it promised land. He took her to the little garden behind the shop where a small table sat under a fig tree. The air smelled of green leaves and soap and the faint iron tang of urban life not far off. He had tucked the photograph of the house into a pocket watch frame again and set it on the table. For a long moment neither spoke. "I bought the claim to make sure your father could not sell you that day," he said finally, "but I also looked for a place that might be more than a shelter. He waited. "I would like you to consider making it ours if you want that." The word ours was careful. It asked as a proposition. Sarah felt a weight shift in the room between them. She could say no. She could say yes. She could ask for changes. She was no longer a woman for whom a choice would be made by others. "What would that mean?" she asked. "For me," Wade said, "it means that I will share the work. I will not pretend to know every stitch or every book of ledgers. I will ask and learn. I will stand guard, but I will also make supper and mend harness. I want to be a partner, not a proprietor." Sarah listened, thinking through the images that had once been outside her reach. A house whose porch had space for a sewing bench, a ledger in which her name might appear for decisions, not lines of debt, a life shaped by shared labor. "And the legal part?" she asked. "What of title and how it's recorded?" Wade had thought of this. He took from his pocket a legal paper, drafts the judge had reviewed, and pushed it forward. In clear language, the draft proposed that the trust's portion be conveyed to Sarah under terms that would allow her to accept in her name and to declare a partnership in which both had voice. Judge Harmon had, at Wade's prompting, prepared options that preserved Sarah's authority. Cordelia stood at the edge of the bench, her palms folded as if waiting for the stitch to finish. Sarah read the document, and though she was not a lawyer, the sense of the language was clear enough. Her consent would be necessary. She could hold title. The trust existed to preserve, not to coerce. She could accept and still be free. The idea felt like the work of reassembling a broken pattern into something new. She looked up. "If I take it," she said, not as a question but as a condition, "it will be as my choice. It will not be because your coin rewrites my life." Wade's face softened into something that might have been a smile. "I would not wish it any other way," he said. "It will be yours with my heart in it, if you'll have it." Cordelia's intervention, when it came, was matter of fact. "If you do this," she said, "you should make it known what it means in town. Don't let men think a woman who accepts help has lost the right to stand." She proposed a local notice of the arrangement that explained Sarah's ownership and the judge's order as a matter of record. It was prudent and blunt and suited the town. Sarah asked for a little time more. She wanted to sew up a few things, to see the spring harvest at Cordelia's, to close a couple accounts. The judge's papers were patient. The trust, the judge had assured, would not insist on a precipitate decision. The man who had once thought to turn her into a transaction had been checked. The law had given her space to choose. She used it. Winter came again before any formal decision had been penned and filed. They married in December, in a ceremony that spoke of small joys rather than grandeur. The day was cool, with a light that fell like washed linen across the city. Cordelia had arranged a modest celebration, a small gathering in the back garden with only those who had been close in the months of trial and rebuilding. Frances brought a loaf of bread, May a jar of preserved fruit, Rose a tin of peppermint for luck. They did not exchange vows that spoke of ownership or of unilateral promises. They spoke instead of partnership and of mutual commitment. Wade's words were plain and careful. Sarah's were shaped like a seam, practical, exact, and true. They both promised to preserve each other's choice, to speak plainly when decisions needed making, and to share the labor of a life. The ring, when it was given, was simple, a band from an old spoon Wade had kept and had reshaped as a symbol of thrift and care. It was not a token of possession, it was a clasp of intention. Their marriage did not erase the past. Zakaria's imprisonment was still a reality, and sometimes letters came from remote jails that carried the same smallness of a man who had been stripped of his illusions. Once he wrote, both contrite and defiant, and Sarah read the pages without tearing. She felt pity and anger as two independent things and folded the letter with the care one gives unwanted patterns. The house on the ranch was not an instant idle. There were leaky gutters that woke them in the night, a stubborn fence that needed mending, and a herd of mares that demanded attention. There were seasons of too much rain and of not enough. The work was constant. They learned to sit down together to plan, a ledger on the kitchen table, threads and nails arrayed like tools in the same kit. Cordelia visited often, bringing bolts of cloth and advice. Frances and May came to apprentice with Sarah for weeks at a time, learning how to measure and cut, how to price a bodice so a woman could live by her talent. The sewing machine, Cordelia's gift, sat on a bench with oil rubbed into its joints, humming when in use and quiet when idle. Pregnancy came some seasons after the marriage, quiet as a stitch, and a child arrived whose name they gave as William. He was long-limbed and quick to smile, and the house rearranged itself to his presence. Later they welcomed Eleanor, smaller and fierce, whose first words were more like commands than requests. The children belonged to both of them, and for Sarah, motherhood was another manifold of choice, not something that took her autonomy, but something that invited new decisions about how she wished to live and teach. Sarah's dress business expanded in increments that pleased her. Letters from people in neighboring towns came asking for dresses that fit more than measurements. Cordelia helped Sarah build a small line of working women's garments, durable and sensible, that sold steadily. Sarah kept accounts, and she kept ledgers that bore her signature. She hired apprentices and taught them not only stitches but the thing Cordelia had taught her, to count wages, to open a ledger, to hold clients by service rather than by pity. Wade's ranch prospered in a way that felt honest rather than flashy. They planted 2 small orchards and a garden that fed their kitchen through winters. He trained hands and apprenticed a young foreman who learned to read the land and tended animals with a soft but firm hand. When tavern tales in paradise swung between mockery and admiration, the ranch sent out no proclamations. It worked, it sheltered, it gave. Zakaria's punishment came to an end in the ordinary way of sentences. He left the jail with less noise than he had arrived. Some years later, in a letter that read more like the confession of an old man than like the bitter protest of the father who had sold his claim, he acknowledged the wrong of his choice. Sarah read it without triumph. He had been punished. That had been the law's job. Her life had moved on. Years gathered like patchwork. Cordelia's shop continued to flourish and became a hub for women who wanted to learn trades and to keep accounts of their own. Sarah opened a small side business, a line of alterations and tailored garments for women who worked in offices and in the streets. She employed 2 women from Cordelia's apprenticeships and paid them with a fairness that, in small ways, rewrote what such work could mean. Their shop window displayed bolts of cloth with labels that told price and labor openly, transparency as dignity. Wade and Sarah's partnership had its own rhythms. They argued, as any pair will, over seeds and accounts and the right time to wean a child. They came to arguments with the ordinary decency that Providence sometimes affords loving people, willingness to listen and to repair. There were nights when Sarah would sit at her sewing bench while William slept, and Eleanor giggled in the room next door, and Wade would bring in a lantern and a tin of sugar and say nothing but let her continue, his presence a constant welcome. It was not always easy. The weather could ruin a crop and force them to tighten accounts, but they kept their practices of partnership, debate and decision, and shared work. 5 years after the hammer had fallen in the auction room, the ranch sat in a late afternoon light that made everything look gilded. Children's laughter threaded through the fields. William running with a stick, Eleanor chasing a blue ribbon that had snagged in the grass. Sarah leaned on the porch rail, watching, a spool of thread by her elbow and a small stack of patterns folded neatly on the head of a chair behind her. Her hands were as sure as ever, fingers that had learned to count stitches like currency. Cordelia visited with a tin of preserved figs and stories of the city's comings and goings. Judge Harmon had come once, not as a man of robes, but as a neighbor, and sat on the porch while Wade brought cold lemonade, and the judge told a story about statutes that had learned to bend so people might stand. The sheriff stopped by now, and then with news and sometimes an apology that spoke more of how people changed than of how they had been cruel. They had, all of them, the marks of life that comes from steady choices. A child's painted stool, a spool of blue thread left near the bench, a ledger with Sarah's handwriting neat at its head. Sarah's business had grown into a small network of commissions. She sent a trunk of dresses to a neighboring town each season, and Cordelia oversaw a small accounting ledger that listed wages, purchases, and the names of apprentices. Women came to learn and to leave with their pockets a little heavier than when they had arrived. The ranch's gate bore a simple sign, Adams Lawrence, the hyphen more a promise than a requirement, a name that suggested a joint enterprise rather than an ownership claim. One evening, as the sun slid behind a line of low hills and the porch light glowed like a small watchfire, Sarah sat with a dress half done and listened to the children play in the yard. William's laugh sounded like a bell. Eleanor's voice pitched high as she commanded the family dog. Wade stirred the coals for a moment and then sat beside her, handing over a cup of tea. He rested his elbow on the rail and looked out across the field they had planted together. "You know," he said softly, "I never thought I'd end up liking the smell of starch." She laughed, a small sound of pleasure. "It's a smell of work done well," she said. "It's good." He reached for her hand and she let him take it. They had a kind of silence that was companionable, the one that belongs to people who have made hard choices together and who are now permitted to be quiet with their satisfaction. "Where do you want to go now?" he asked, not as a trap but out of an old habit and with a smile that recognized their history. She turned the question into a small harvest of its own. The words that had once been the axis of a rescue had become the way they planned their days. "Here," she said after a moment, and in that one word were all the directions she had chosen. The shop, the garden, the porch, the children, the ledger. "Here," she repeated, and the word landed like a stitch that finishes a seam. It was not the end of roaming. It was the choice to remain in a place that had been chosen by both of them. In the yard the children fell into a rowboat of laughter, and the dog barked a single happy note. Cordelia's voice gently corrected a mismeasured hem through an open window. Judge Harmon, waving as he left, tipped his hat as if to an ally in a battle that had not been quite won. The life before them had been shaped by law, and by courage, and by the slow building of trust. It had been, to those who had watched and misread it on that auction platform, an ending none of them had seen. That day the hammer had fallen as a verdict. On this porch, years later, there was no hammer, only a child's wooden mallet used for knocking out calico, a small husbandry of tools and hands. Where the auction once had made a woman public property in the gossip of a town, the ranch had become a place where a woman's work and choice were plainly visible. valued in coins, in stitches, and in the names written across ledgers. If you enjoyed this unexpected rescue and the ending no one saw coming, click to find more stories like Sarah's and follow the path of choices that change a life.